Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going beyond the I Have a Dream speech
Oh, yeah.
and exploring some of the lesser-known sides of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and legacy.
Sure.
And to guide us today, we've got this great podcast episode titled 74, Martin Luther King Jr., Successes, Setbacks, and Shifting Strategies in the Civil Rights Movement.
Wow.
So get ready for a fascinating look at Dr. King.
Yeah, it's funny how we often think of Dr. King as this lone figure at the forefront of the movement.
Yeah.
But he was actually really great at recognizing the work that was already happening and amplifying it.
Right.
Like, take the Montgomery Bus Boycott, for example. It was already going on when he became a prominent leader.
Yeah, he had this incredible sense of timing.
Yeah.
Like knowing when to step in and bring a local struggle to national attention. What was it about Montgomery that made him so effective there?
Well, the source material emphasizes that he didn't just lead, he united.
Okay.
He brought together all these different groups within the Black community, inspiring them with his powerful speeches and his vision.
Yeah.
Imagine the courage it took for people to boycott those buses.
Oh, yeah.
They faced real hardships, threats every day.
Yeah.
King gave them a voice, a sense of purpose,
Okay.
and he gave them a strategy rooted in nonviolent resistance. It was this combination that really set the stage for all the victories that would come later.
It's amazing. And speaking of those later victories,
Yeah.
the source material mentions the sit-ins, the freedom rides. He didn't start those either.
Nope.
But his support brought them into the national spotlight.
Right.
Do you think that was intentional on his part?
Oh, absolutely. King understood the power of symbolism
Okay.
and the media's attention. Those dramatic confrontations, especially when they were met with violence,
Right.
they forced America to face the ugliness of segregation head on.
Yeah.
And he was brilliant at using the media. He turned local incidents into national news, and that put pressure on the government to act. Like with the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It was organized by A. Philip Randolph. But
Oh, yeah, the I Have a Dream speech.
yeah, exactly.
I mean, you can't think of the march without thinking about that speech.
Right. It's amazing how that one speech continues to inspire people even today.
Yeah, it's truly iconic.
Yeah.
But the source materials suggest that King's journey wasn't always easy.
No, not at all.
There were setbacks, adjustments, and even criticism from within the Black community,
Yeah, for sure.
like the Albany movement and the St. Augustine campaign. The source material talks about the challenges he faced
Yeah,
when he encountered these more subtle forms of resistance.
right. In Albany, Georgia, for example, the police deliberately avoided those brutal crackdowns
Oh,
that
interesting.
would happen in Birmingham.
So without those shocking images of violence,
Yeah,
it was harder to gain public support.
exactly. King's nonviolent strategy. It was most effective when it exposed that brutality for the world to see.
Right.
Without that stark visual contrast, his message didn't land with the same impact.
It makes you wonder,
Yeah.
what happens when the opposition uses a less visible, a more insidious kind of resistance?
That's a really good question. And it's one that King himself had to grapple with throughout his career.
So did he end up changing his tactics in
Yeah.
response to this new challenge?
He had to adapt. Yeah. In 1966, he went to Chicago,
Okay.
and he faced a whole different beast altogether.
Oh, really?
You see, in the North, it was systemic racism baked into those cities.
Okay.
Discriminatory housing policies, unequal schools, deep-rooted economic disparities. It wasn't just about changing laws anymore.
So the fight had to go deeper.
Exactly. And his efforts in Chicago are really fascinating because some historians, especially those from what's called the social historiography school, they see this as a turning point.
Interesting.
They argue that this is where the limitations of his earlier strategies really became apparent.
Yeah, and the source material describes his agreement with Mayor Daley on fair housing as a paper victory,
Right.
meaning
Yeah.
he secured some concessions.
Yeah.
But they didn't necessarily translate into tangible changes for the people he was fighting for.
Exactly. It was a victory in principle, but not really in practice. And this shift to the North coincided with another big challenge, a growing divide within the civil rights movement itself.
Oh, you're talking about the rise of Black power.
Exactly. Figures like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, they started to question the effectiveness of King's nonviolent approach.
Especially when faced with such deep-seated economic and social inequality.
Yeah, they felt like a more forceful response was needed, something that directly addressed those systemic issues.
Yeah, I can see how that would create tension within the movement.
Oh, absolutely. The source material points to the Meredith March Against Fear in 1966
Okay.
as a really powerful symbol of this divide.
What happened there?
You had King, committed to nonviolence, walking side by side with Carmichael,
Wow.
who advocated for a more militant stance.
Yeah, it's a powerful image.
It really encapsulates the complexities of the movement at that time.
Yeah, it shows that delicate tightrope that King was walking.
Right.
Criticized by some for being too accommodating to white society, while others felt he wasn't radical enough.
Exactly.
Ah.
He was constantly navigating these competing pressures, trying to hold the movement together,
Wow.
while also pushing it forward.
So how did he navigate all of that? How did he respond to those challenges? Where did he go from there?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. He started to shift his focus even more towards economic justice.
So he was realizing that just getting rid of those segregation laws wasn't enough.
Yeah,
He had to tackle those underlying causes of poverty and inequality.
exactly. And it wasn't just about Black people.
Right, it was affecting people of all races.
Right. And that's where we see him really starting to wrestle with the limits of those earlier strategies.
Yeah, those tactics that worked so well in the South, like exposing that brutality of segregation, they weren't as effective against those more subtle forms of racism up north.
Yeah, it was a different kind of enemy up there.
Right? It's like you can't just fight that with marches and sit-ins.
No, you need a different approach.
And the source material talks about this idea from the revisionist school of historians.
Right.
They say that those later campaigns, like the Poor People's Campaign,
Yeah.
they were held back by a lack of resources and even some division within the movement itself.
Yeah, those internal struggles definitely played a role.
And it even mentions that public support was starting to fade.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe people were just getting tired of the fight.
It's possible.
Or maybe they didn't see economic inequality as being as urgent as legal segregation.
It's a good point. You know, it's easier to rally people around a clear enemy,
Right.
a visible injustice.
Mm-hmm.
But these systemic issues like poverty, they require a different approach.
Right. You have to get to the root causes.
And that's a much harder sell.
So how did King try to bridge that gap?
Well, he launched the Poor People's Campaign.
Okay.
It was this really bold attempt to unite those marginalized communities
Yeah.
across all racial lines to demand economic reforms from the government.
And the source material calls it a noble but ultimately impractical endeavor.
Yeah, it was a bit ahead of its time, maybe.
What was his vision for it?
He imagined this huge multiracial coalition marching on Washington, D.C.,
Wow.
demanding things like living wages, guaranteed jobs, and end to poverty.
It sounds like a continuation of that idea of
Yeah.
using powerful symbolism.
Exactly. But this time, it was about highlighting the struggles of poor people.
Okay.
Not just Black Americans, but poor whites, poor Latinos.
Yeah. Anyone who is struggling.
Exactly. It was about dismantling those systems that create poverty,
Right.
regardless of your race.
It was a really radical idea for the time.
It was. It really pushed the boundaries of what the civil rights movement had been up to that point.
And then, of course, his assassination in 1968.
It cut that vision short.
Yeah. It's hard not to think about what might have been if he had lived.
It's one of those what-ifs in history.
The Poor People's Campaign did continue after his death.
Right.
But it faced so many obstacles.
Yeah.
And it never really reached that same level of impact that King was hoping for.
But even though it wasn't fully realized,
Right.
it still tells us a lot about how his thinking was evolving.
Yeah.
He was willing to challenge the status quo, to push the movement beyond those initial goals,
Yeah.
and to really grapple with those connections between racial and economic injustice.
He was always looking ahead,
He was a true visionary.
always adapting to the changing times and expanding his vision to include more people.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear what stood out to you about King's later years and that shift towards economic justice.
Yeah, it really highlights how the movement itself was changing, too. You
Yeah.
know, it went from fighting that outright segregation in the South to dealing with these deeper, more systemic issues in the North.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that he wasn't making these changes in a vacuum.
Right.
He was responding to what the Black community needed and wanted.
Exactly. He was listening to the people who felt like the movement had to go further, that it wasn't enough to just focus on legal equality.
Right. They wanted to address the root causes of poverty and marginalization.
Exactly.
And it brings us back to that tension between King's commitment to nonviolence and the rise of Black power. That image of him and Stokely Carmichael walking side by side during the Meredith March.
Yeah.
It's such a powerful moment.
Yeah.
really captures that internal debate within the movement.
It does. It represents that question of which path would lead to true liberation.
Right. And King was right in the middle of it all.
He was trying to hold the movement together while also pushing it forward.
The source material calls it a delicate tightrope.
He was getting criticized from both sides.
Yeah, some people thought he was too willing to compromise with white society, while others thought he wasn't radical enough.
It's amazing that he was able to handle all of that pressure
Yeah.
and still keep fighting for his vision of a just and equitable society.
And it wasn't just about changing laws or policies.
Right.
It was about creating a society where everyone had the opportunity to thrive.
Exactly. No matter their race or economic background.
And that's what the Poor People's Campaign was all about, wasn't it?
It was. He wanted to build this huge multiracial coalition united by that shared struggle for economic justice.
It was such a bold move.
It was. He knew that poverty wasn't just a problem for Black people.
Yeah.
It was a problem for society as a whole.
And it needed a collective response.
Absolutely.
It's just so sad that he didn't live to see it through.
Yeah. This makes you wonder what could have been.
The source material says that the Poor People's Campaign continued after his death,
Right.
but it faced a lot of obstacles,
It did.
and it never really achieved the kind of change that King was hoping for.
It's possible that it was just too ambitious for its time.
Maybe. But even though it wasn't fully realized,
Yeah.
it still shows how deeply committed he was to creating a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely. King's legacy isn't just about the things he accomplished. It's also about the challenges he faced, the changes he made, and that unwavering belief in the power of people coming together.
Yeah, to create a better future.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I want to leave you with a question.
Okay.
What parts of his story resonate with you the most today?
Yeah. What aspects of his life and work do you find yourself thinking about?
Is it his commitment to nonviolence?
His incredible strategies.
Or maybe that vision he had of a society where everyone is treated equally and fairly?
And how can we use his example to continue that fight for justice?
How can we make a difference in our own time and in our own ways?
King's life and legacy show us that even when things are tough, we can still make a difference.
Right. We can choose to have hope instead of giving in to despair.
We can be brave instead of being complacent.
And we can choose love over hate.
That's the most important lesson we can learn from Dr. King.
That no matter what challenges we face, we can all work towards a better future.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.